Uncle Dan,
Yes.
you in a good mood?
I mean, I am right now.
Well, I think Uncle Mark's here to take care of that for you.
Fixing to ruin it for everybody, huh?
Yeah, this is how I view the holiday season, guys. So,
Oh, God.
so no cute lead-in with a wacky pop culture reference today. This is a terrible story, and I really couldn't make that many laughs out of this one. So I've actually been putting this topic off for a while, but I just felt like we need to have a talk about this. So
You're too close. You should have let one of us do it. We would have made so much fun.
yeah, I did. I am too as the chief gay correspondent. I think it is my duty. However, so
Yes, indeed.
like we said in the intro, this segment is about the abuse, dehumanization, and in some cases, total destruction of perfectly healthy, innocent people for no fucking justifiable reason at all. This segment includes graphic descriptions of torture, brutality, humiliation, and suicide. These were directed against people in the LGBTQ spectrum and even those just suspected of being part of that spectrum. It's heartbreaking and hideous, so if you have any sensitivity to any of that subject matter, or heaven forfend if you yourself were subjected to any part of this program, please turn off the podcast now.
Yeah.
Bye.
If you continue to listen and are traumatized by the content, it's on you. This should serve as sufficient warning. No angry emails starting now. So, when we did the Anthill Kids segment a while back, as I was preparing it, I wondered about the ethics of even covering it on the show at all. Yes, it was a fucking nightmarish thing, but our mission statement as a show is examining the excesses of irrational thinking and belief, and both this story and that one are prime examples of the pointless human misery belief can cause. Now, the other reason I want to tell this story is that it's so fucking recent. Many who suffered in these programs are still alive, as are some of the people who engineered them. None of the guilty have paid any price or ever apologized, and the surviving victims have continued to suffer with no hope of justice or remediation. Pardon me. So, an hour south of our fair city is a place called Provo, Utah. I know. I also wish it wasn't true, but it is. And in Provo, Utah, is Brigham Young University. For those who don't know, it was named after the second prophet of the Mormon Church and the true father of what modern Mormonism has become, Brigham Young. He was a cruel and unforgiving man, and as we shall see, the university that bears his name shares that DNA with him. So Mormonism from the end of World War II, and certainly before that, but just for our purposes here, from the end of World War II all the way through the Cold War, was almost an entirely Utah-based phenomenon. It was and still is a very inward-looking faith. Its highly inflated martyrdom mythos and its mountain isolation kept most outside ideas at bay, which they were very happy about. Young Mormon men were expected to finish high school, go on a 2-year mission while trying to notice as little about the fallen world they passed through as possible, come home, go to Brigham Young University, find a wife, get married, have kids, rinse, repeat, the circle of beige life, right?
Yeah.
Now, not quite as much these days, but definitely back then, for some Mormon kids, BYU was not an option, it was the option. Hyper-conservative parents knew that their children would not receive any sort of liberal education at BYU, and intense standards of, quote, morality and chaste behaviors are even today enforced there, as we'll explore in this segment. If you required your parents' help or even permission to go to college, BYU was often the only one you could go to. So a little about BYU's history with this. In 1962, BYU apparently suddenly realized there was such a thing as gay people,
Gross.
and established a total ban on them attending the university. In 1964, apostle and future prophet Spencer W. Kimball, a villain that will loom large in this story, gave a speech at BYU that said homosexuality was a malady, a disease, and an abominable and detestable crime against nature that was curable by self-mastery. In September of 1965, then Brigham Young University President Wilkinson addressed the incoming freshmen with, "We do not intend to admit to this campus any homosexuals. If any of you have this tendency, may I suggest you leave the university immediately. We do not want others on this campus to be contaminated by your presence."
Oh, my God.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a very nice welcome speech.
Let's roll out that welcome mat. Huh? Also in 1965, The Advocate, a national LGBTQ news and advocacy magazine, reported on the suicides of 5 young gay male students that year who had been ensnared by snitches and surveillance and brought before a disciplinary council before their suicides. BYU, of course, had no comment on that. By 1968, the paranoid, bunkered church and university authorities, alarmed by the liberalization of American society in general and teeny tiny attempts at it on their own remote campus, went full Stasi, the East German secret police. If a student was turned in by his roommates, and it was almost always a he, it seems Mormons at the time couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of gay women. And trans people, baby steps, guys. Let them persecute people as they become comfortable enough to do it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, if you were turned in for suspected homosexual activity on or off campus, this young man would find himself being interrogated by Apostle Spencer W. Kimball. He who happily reported that the church's cultural genocide program in Navajo country was turning natives white and delightsome. See episode 150 for that gem. Kimball would offer a choice: immediate expulsion from school and letters to the family explaining exactly why he was being expelled. And by the way, the expulsion often came with a hold on records, making transfer to another school with accrued credits impossible.
Oh, my God.
And also letting any other potential school know why you had been expelled. Or you could write down on a piece of paper the names of all the other queers in your disgusting little homo network for them to go after.
And I'm sure you're going to cover this, Mark, but the shame of being expelled from BYU it's hard to describe how devastating.
Even if it wasn't for being gay.
Right.
Even if you were just a fuck up or something and got expelled, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're being kicked out of God's school.
Well, and I think there was always kind of the assumption for anyone who was kicked out that was why.
Right. And also know that if the region is what it is, and it certainly was worse at the time, but if you got expelled from BYU, a lot of career paths just closed to you in Utah, right? You're never going to be at this law firm. You're never going to get you're never going to be able to work at this insurance company. So it could fuck people up profoundly. So Kimball and the other leadership soon found themselves panicked to be hip deep in 76 known or suspected homosexual Mormon boys. It was obviously a purposeful invasion by the evil forces of Big Gay, rather than just a program of desperate young kids ratting each other out to try to save their own asses and their very lives.
Right.
As they say at BYU, snitches get cross stitches. Nice little crafts to hang in the powder room that say, "Good on ya, kid. Go Cougs." That's probably the only joke I can pull out of this segment, guys. So I'd appreciate a little more encouragement.
Go Cougs.
Before long, BYU was sending campus police, basically mall cops, 60 miles south to Salt Lake City to surveil the handful of gay bars here, looking for cars with BYU tags. They placed entrapment men-sinking men ads in Salt Lake City, want ads and newspapers to try to catch BYU students. Kids who had been turned in were sometimes made to wear wires to parties or events where gay people were suspected of being.
Oh, my God.
Bugs were placed in dorm rooms and on the phone lines of suspected gay kids.
Unbelievable.
A campus police whistleblower in the mid-1970s was horrified by these practices and was told it was totally standard work for the campus police department. He went public about it, and BYU's denial, not denial, was pretty hilarious. Jumping ahead a bit, but just to help illustrate the insanity of the anti-gay jihad at BYU, in 1975, plainclothes and undercover campus police swarmed the fine arts school, pulling all male ballet and drama students out of class and interrogating them publicly, Chinese Cultural Revolution style, in front of their fellow students. And,
holy shit.
And all but this last part was overseen and directed by Mormon apostle Spencer W. Kimball, not that last police raid, because by then he was the prophet and handed that off to somebody else.
Wow, that's incredible.
So, and it was all also overseen during the worst years of the gay purges and persecutions at BYU, and the horrors to come, the years being 1971 to 1980, by then University President Dallin H. Oaks. In 1976, partially as a reaction to the American Psychological Association delisting homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder, Oakes and church leaders decided something more concrete had to be done about the homosexual menace their fever dreams told them was hollowing out the church and BYU from the inside. Oakes and the church created the Orwellian-named Values Institute, a pseudo-scientific propaganda mill that would create, quote, scientific data to support their increasingly arcane and bigoted views on homosexuality. Its first goal was to assign BYU psychologist Alan Bergen to write a book to be published by a non-church publisher to give it an air of legitimacy, and to otherwise create academic papers to give scientific support to their hatred of gay people. Out of the Values Institute were born the infamous BYU electrocution, torture, conversion therapy programs. Quick note, BYU already had an aversion therapy program, as they called it, since 1960, so for 16 years by then. But the aversion therapy program was very much like the junk science and traumatizing techniques used in the conversion therapy program. It's kind of a difference without a real difference.
Right.
But instead of electroshock, powerful drugs were used to make people vomit and feel intense discomfort when they were shown gay pornography, and then other drugs to bring about euphoric feelings when shown straight pornography and images of chaste Mormon girls. One survivor of the aversion therapy program was just 15 when his bishop made him go through it, without his parents' consent or even knowledge.
Oh, my God.
Whoa.
The bishop told them he was going to a genealogy summer camp for a few weeks down at the BYU campus.
Holy shit.
So think about that. A confused and frightened 15-year-old kid who had never even seen pornography is shown graphic images of men fucking, given powerful and dangerous intravenous drugs that forced him to vomit uncontrollably without his parents' knowledge as a human medical experiment for his religion.
Wow.
And he was far from the only minor to pass through this hellscape. So in 1975, the vomit-inducing drug torture was replaced with, and according to a couple sources, sometimes combined with, electrocution. So how did this program with a 100% rate of failure work? Once your roommates ratted you out, or a mall cop 60 miles outside of his jurisdiction saw you leaving the old Radio City bar in Salt Lake, or Spencer W. Kimball had blackmailed a friend of yours into giving you up, you would be presented with a way to finish your degree and keep your little secret from your family, which was a course of weekly torture appointments in the basement of the psychology building. But first, you were required to procure pornographic images you found arousing. Now,
wow. You get to, it's like go pick a switch.
It's even worse than that. So for young listeners, in 1976, porn wasn't just a click away on your phone. You actually had to go to a sleazy adult bookstore or magazine shop, poke around till you found what floated your boat, then have the courage to let the cashier see what kind of thing gave you a boner. For many of these young guys who were devoutly Mormon, that alone was a traumatizing experience. Pornography is very verboten in the Mormon church. Then you had to take it to a specific camera shop in Provo in a plain manila envelope and use some code word when you handed it to the guy behind the counter so he could make it into slides at your expense to take to your own torture. So humiliation and dehumanization were very conscious elements of this, quote, therapy.
That's fucking insane.
It's insane. So now BYU officially denied this ever happened for years, only making a very partial and not very sorry admission in 2011, but for some reason still denied that drugs were ever used. They're like, oh yeah, we shocked the shit out of people, but we never used drugs.
Weird.
But at the time, they emphasized participation was voluntary. While I've already described the brutal coercions that drove people to cooperate, here's how one survivor answered when he was asked why he volunteered for the torture. Quote, seriously, you must be delusional. I did not volunteer for this. I was told I must do it, or all my confessions to church leaders would be shared with my family, local ward, and stake members, and I would be excommunicated. Not that it matters to me now, but as a young person, you are ingrained with the notion that you do whatever a church leader or authority says, without question. Being from a small town in Utah, that could absolutely destroy a person's chance for work or being able to live in that community. I ended up going 1,500 miles away just to get away from this after it happened. After 36 years, I moved back to Utah, but the nightmares and flashbacks are coming back more vividly than I expected. So,
Wow.
Yeah. So much for fucking voluntary. Now, I should add, while participation in this horror was coerced, there were plenty of frightened, closeted gay kids that did want to change if there was some way to do it.
Right.
America at the time was hardly an ideal place to live out loud as a gay person, and the Mormon Church was worse by leagues. So sad as it is, some of these kids, as terrified as they were, as coerced as they were, they hoped it would work, right? So back to how this was conducted. After you had gone to the photo shop to pick up your shaming slides, you reported to the basement of the psych building on the campus, and you would you would have to sign the following release in order for your, quote, voluntary torture to begin. And I got this from the BYU library, so anybody who thinks I'm making this shit up.
This was in there. Like, is this like an artifact, or is this still...
This is part of this release is part of a larger academic paper I'll talk about in a second.
Holy cow.
So it says, I, blank space, your name here, witness the fact that I have had explained to me all the various ramifications of experimental aversion techniques used to counter-condition inappropriate emotional propensities like those of my own. I fully realize that these procedures are experimental in nature of their design and application, and their application to me will likely produce a great deal of discomfort, and that, perhaps, tissue and organ damage could result.
Holy fuck.
My God.
Yeah. Nevertheless, I agree to allow Dr. D. Eugene Thorne and his clinical associates to administer these experimental averse techniques to me in any way their judgment would seem appropriate to therapeutic objectives. I also witness the fact that the visual, auditory, and other sensory modality stimuli used to counter-condition my inappropriate emotional propensities have either been provided by me or I have agreed to use them as directed by Dr. D. Eugene Thorne and his clinical associates. Some of these materials could be construed to be socially or morally offensive. Finally, I release Dr. D. Eugene Thorne and his clinical associates from all legal liabilities that could result from treatment provided me from them and from communication of my case to materials to other clinically oriented individuals. Then you would sign and date it.
Wow.
I love the wording that that all of this is a counter to inappropriate feelings.
Yeah.
It's about propriety, you guys. It's not about anything
Yeah.
pathological or harmful. Just inappropriate.
It's appearances, isn't it?
Well,
Like, it's like they knew they weren't going to change these people. They knew that they were just going to make them never act on their natural impulses.
right. And it has the sanitized language of John Hughes torture memos during the Bush years, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's super ugly. And I'd be very interested to hear from any legal, anybody, with like Andrew or somebody listening who could tell us if that thing actually could be enforced. So then you were led to a room, strapped to a reclining chair, and a device called a plethysmograph was attached to your penis. This is a highly sensitive electronic device that can detect arousal. Then electrodes were placed any number of places, upper arms, upper inner thighs, wrists, etc. I've read the academic paper that release was included in about how this was to be conducted by Max Ford McBride. And while the paper doesn't instruct clinicians to put a shocking electrode directly to the genitals, several survivors attest to that having been the case.
right.
So you were electric. It sounds like there was a lot of freelancing with this
Well,
thing.
I mean, if it weren't so awful, if it were all actually voluntary, some of that sounds kind of sexy, actually.
Oh, God. I'm not going to touch that. So once you were all wired up, a psychology undergrad TA behind mirrored glass would begin to play the pornographic slideshow you had just paid for. When the it's a hard word to say, plethysmograph detected an increase in the size of your penis, the TA would deliver a shock lasting from 3 to 10 seconds.
Oh, my God.
And here's a detail I find particularly hideous in all this garbage. You yourself would choose the intensity of the shock.
Right.
The person strapped to the chair had a dial which could turn the voltage up or down, thus making the victim even more complicit in his own torture. Survivors were called Dr. Thorne and his co-director of this program, Dr. Robert Dwayne Card, telling them it wouldn't work unless they used the maximum voltage. More on Card in a minute. But the higher voltages resulted in severe burns and physical scarring, brutal reminders for survivors to this day. So after half an hour or more of pain and terror looking at images and being electrocuted, the TA would switch to soothing music and images of heterosexual pornography or whatever they determined to be positive heteronormative images. In this incredibly simplistic, truly idiotic view of human sexuality and psychology, these religious quacks thought they could flip a switch by making gay bad and straight good with this bullshit therapy. In the words of the Mormon missionaries in the Book of Mormon musical, they thought they could just turn it off, right?
Right.
So perfectly normal, healthy young people endured this horror a minimum of 22 times, 22 sessions.
Wow.
More if the therapist thought it hadn't taken yet, and potentially substantially more.
And I got news for you. It hadn't.
Yeah, I'll get to the stats here in a minute.
Yeah.
It should be noted that the main record of this nightmare, the academic paper I mentioned by Max Ford McBride, which declares this a successful program, talks about a group of just 17 male subjects, quote, volunteering for this treatment, with 14 finishing it. The paper congratulates itself for being a smashing success, declaring that aversion therapy via humiliation, dehumanization, and electroshock torture works just perfectly. Thanks, everybody, but the credit really goes to Jesus. Hilariously, it declares itself a total success while admitting in the conclusion that there were only 14 subjects, all in the same age range, all Mormons, all from the same geographic region, and all male, and there was no long-term follow-ups to track behavioral changes. As clinical trials go, its metrics are a laughable disaster. But since torturous aversion therapies had been banned by the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, BYU had to keep a lid on this evil. Like, they had to do this in secret.
So it had already been banned. It's not like they were doing something that everybody else was like,
I couldn't find the exact. I think it was right when they delisted homosexuality as a psychological disorder. Because
but I know, like experimenting on human subjects, just as a concept within the psychiatric community, was banned like before the 60s, right?
No. There's all kinds of psychological experiments that can to this day continue, but they're done under certain ethical strictures, right? These were not. It seems like there was no ethical oversight of any kind, including at BYU, right? As it happens, I know one of the TAs who participated in this conversion therapy program.
Really?
Yeah, and you know him too. And I know he's struggled with the weight of his guilt at having been part of it. He's in a documentary on the subject. And he knows a lot of the people who went through this, and just from his own experience, calculates a 0% success rate. But as the victim of any sort of torture will tell you, you'll say anything to make it stop.
Of course.
So they all told Dr. Thorne and Dr. Card they were all better now, thank you very much. But the church had proof it worked, you see. At the completion of the course of the treatment, men would get a form letter from Spencer W. Kimball's office stating that they had been fully cured of gayness and were doing just fine as normal heterosexual Mormon men. It was intimated that this was your final condition of keeping your little secret secret. So what could you do? You signed it. Then Kimball would show all the signed affidavits of heterosexuality, closing the loop of total bullshit with a nice little bow. See, it works because we tortured and blackmailed people into saying it did. But as my friend noted in the documentary, if making gay men straight was the goal of the program, it failed spectacularly. If the goal was to pump out brutally traumatized torture victims who would spend most of the rest of their lives struggling with intimacy and in great pain, it was incredibly successful. Remember, the 14 people in the paper on the subject were just a small portion of men and women who suffered these programs over the course of 20 years. But because of the trauma surrounding it and the desire never to speak of it again, I was unable to find even a good estimate of the number of victims of this program. Several suicides followed immediately on the completion of the program, with 3 young men hanging themselves in the campus fine arts building in rapid succession.
Jesus.
While it's hard to know because the lack of good data, scores of other suicides have been blamed on the program. Many survivors did as they were told and married somebody, anybody, so long as it was a woman, as quickly as possible, resulting in a huge number of strained and failed marriages, many with children, making this particular torture program brutalizing to a second generation as well. As one survivor put it pretty succinctly, marriage is the rug under which the brethren encourage many men to sweep their homosexuality. Advising the homosexual to marry is therapy at its worst and spiritual guidance at its most irresponsible. Most survivors' accounts that I read, and a couple of people I have personally known over the years who survived this, have a common thread, that being they were still never attracted to women after this, but their natural attractions to men are so associated with pain and trauma that they have struggled profoundly with intimacy and relationships, even just friendships with other men decades later. The quote I read a bit ago where the survivor talked about moving back to Utah and having debilitating flashbacks 36 years later speaks to the depths of the damage done, right?
Yeah.
While any record of the program has it stopping around the mid-1980s for fear of lawsuit, not out of a single lick of concern for the victims or even its failure rate, the Mormon appetite for making gay go away didn't abate even a little. They outsourced their anti-scientific quackery to an outside wink company called Evergreen, which swore it never did any sort of torture therapy, but rather rewired the gay and lesbian brain by having queers perform heteronormative behaviors out of the fucking 1950s. Women baked, wore makeup, braided hair, men fixed cars, played football, and watched the game. Seriously. But sometime recently, Evergreen got folded into another bullshit outfit, North Star, which I think is still out there scolding gay men for sounding too feminine or crying or whatever their quackery is.
Right.
I have a friend who is now, I think he's around 21 now, who as a teenager wanted to see a therapist for his depression, but the first thing the guy said to him was, "Why do you act so feminine? Men don't speak like that or cross their legs like that." Just like 5 or 6 years ago, this Mormon therapist decided depression wasn't my friend's problem, being gay was. And he found himself stuck in this quack's obsession with making gayness go away. And his parents were totally down with it. But my young friend got his revenge when he became the face of Equality Utah's successful advocacy campaign to have so-called reparative therapy for minors outlawed in Utah. So that's a good thing, trying to find some positive here.
Yeah.
Right.
But back to the bad old days at BYU. As I said, one of the main reasons I wanted to tell this story is that the wronged have never gotten anything for what was done to them. Not a fucking thing. In fact, the official position of the church in BYU has been until very recently, 2011, that none of this ever happened. Which is funny because the academic paper by Max McBride laying it all out in gruesome detail and declaring it a rousing success was in the library at BYU this whole time. You guys should be better at cover-ups by now, right?
Right.
But aside from that, some but not all of the guilty are still alive. Remember Dr. Card, one of the guys telling these poor kids the only way to really cure yourself was to turn it up to 11?
Yeah.
In a little poetic justice, the torturer of BYU died on the day Utah's ban on conversion therapy for minors went into effect.
Oh, no way.
On January 21st of this year. Sadly, according to his obituary, he did not die of electrocution. So, but that's something. And do you remember the president of BYU under the worst years of terror and persecution and electrocution of gay people, Dallin H. Oaks? Yep. Well, guys, he's still here. And any minute now, he's going to get a promotion to prophet, seer, CEO, president, and revelator of Mormonism, Inc. The current president and useless hashtagger, Russell M. Nelson, is 96 years old. And at a spry 88, Oaks, who has never apologized for his overseeing this campaign of terror, human experimentation, blackmail, and literal deaths, may have several years left to bring all he learned as the gay-hating Grand Inquisitor of BYU to bear on the young LGBTQ Mormons in his care. So that's nice. A recent University of Georgia study found that nearly 3/4 of all LGBTQ current and former Mormons likely meet the threshold for a diagnosis of PTSD. 3/4.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's from 2017. Another study found half of LGBTQ BYU students have seriously contemplated suicide. Imagine what those numbers would have been in 1976 if there was any sort of, the 1970s, if there was any sort of survey. Have things at BYU and in the Mormon Church improved for queer people since the 70s? I think you would have to say yes, but these stats say that Mormonism is still not remotely a safe place for my tribe at any age, even today. Post-Mormon therapist and podcaster John DeLynn did some research on the efficacy of the torture program and all the garbage programs that followed it, like Evergreen and North Star. He managed to get around 1,600 gay, current, and former Mormon men to respond to this survey. Around 1,000 of them, that's almost 2/3, said they had been in one or more program to change their orientation, trying for an average of 10 years.
Wow.
Want to guess how many of that 1,000 said they became straight?
I'm thinking of a number.
Not one.
It's not. Yeah.
It's
not above
one.
0.
Oh, yeah, it's a south of 0 number. All the agony, the humiliation, the terror, the shame, the literal deaths these programs caused, all for total failure. I found a ton of really good and fascinating information in a long essay, or short online book, I guess, about queerness in Mormonism by gay activist and historian and BYU conversion therapy survivor Connell O'Donovan. Do you know Connell, Dan?
No, I don't.
Fascinating dude. The essay called The Abominable and Detestable Crime Against Nature, A Revised History of Homosexuality and Mormonism, 1840 to 1980. It's so full of fascinating stuff. It's broad and madly detailed, but he ends his section on the BYU electrocution torture therapy program pretty succinctly, I think. He says, it is an excellent example of clinical dehumanization practiced by Mormon, quote, therapists. In the Mormon worldview, the end certainly justifies the means. Heterosexuality must be attained and maintained at any cost, emphasis his, even if it means using pornography, which the Mormon Church is usually vehemently opposed to, and physical torture. The end. So that is just a brief overview of what went on for 20 years or more at BYU using tithing funds.
Well, I hesitate to ask this question because I don't know if I want to know the answer. But it sounds like the machine for men detected blood rushing to the penis, right?
Yeah.
How did the one for women work?
It doesn't say. The paper doesn't discuss that. And I think the paper discusses outcomes for women, but it doesn't necessarily discuss how, I think they also monitored heart rate. And maybe they, galvanic response, like breathing.
They used an e-meter.
Yeah, basically an e-meter. But I don't know exactly. But there's a couple factors. Like in Mormonism, homosexuality is considered almost entirely a male condition.
Yeah, that's very true.
Right. And so women did go through this and were tortured, but it's really hard to know how many. So there's just not, for reasons that make sense, nobody wants to talk about this who survived it, right? So it's
So I'm the only uncle who actually went to BYU for 1 year.
Yeah.
And I can at least put the tiny feather in my cap that I never ever turned anybody in for anything.
That's good.
Yeah, it is good. I'm proud of that. But I remember the culture and being so snitch based.
Yeah.
And that people were turned in all the time. And it was you could still get expelled for homosexual acts. In fact, I think you still can.
Of course you can.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the honor code change. You did a segment on that, Doug, like earlier in the year, I think.
Yep.
Right, where they, for a minute, the honor code changed. The honor code is the horrible kind of, Leviticus of life at BYU.
Right.
And for a second, they changed it to look like you could actually, if you were gay, queer, you could date, you could show affection, and there was kind of this huge celebration. And then they had to come running back and say, oh, no, we didn't mean it. That's not what we meant at all.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. And so you can still be if you see somebody doing something 100 miles from campus that you know as a BYU student, you can snitch on them, and that counts.
Well, and you know, I remember there's student housing around BYU that is technically an extension of the campus.
Yeah.
And then there's, you know, anywhere you live as a BYU student, you're still under the honor code.
Yeah, in a private residence.
And it has to be approved. It has to be BYU approved housing.
And that means that there's strict rules about, you know, men and women, where they live, shared bathrooms, et cetera, et cetera. But BYU students would and the campus police would look in the windows. This is not that long ago.
Yeah, you were there in the 90s, right?
Yeah, they would look in the window to see things, and you having your blinds drawn was enough to get hauled before a disciplinary board.
Oh my God!
Because what are you hiding?
What the fuck kind of education do you want your fucking? You know, I just don't understand the Mormon idea of the college experience.
Right.
I live in the Joseph Goebbels dormitory.
Yeah, you have to have the middle initial too, though, the Joseph J. Goebbels.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's, you know, where college should be. This is, you want your kids to go off and broaden their minds and experiment and learn new things and, you know, become stimulated, and BYU clearly has always tried to be completely the opposite of that.
Well, or at the very least, not have electrodes strapped to their genitalia.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Fuck. And imagine, like, spare a thought for all the poor, you know, like your friend Mark, who I don't know who it is, so who participated in that as a graduate student. But,
I'll tell you off the air, because
of course,
yeah.
But just the three-dimensional damage that's been done by this program that persists even in the children of people who now, you know, got married
40 years later.
Because they had to. God.
Yeah. And nobody ever said sorry. Nobody ever said we shouldn't be doing this. They just got afraid of, you know, they got spooked by possible lawsuits, so they just outsourced it to some other garbage quasi-Mormon program, right? So, so there you go, guys.
Thanks for
that. A Clockwork Purple.
Okay, you can start listening again now. All right. Let's leave that there.
Moving on.